The meaning of the word slave varies greatly, depending on the era and the geographical location. Slaves in ancient Rome, the era between 750 BCE and 400 CE, may not have technically been slaves at all, depending on how you understand the term. It was, after all, possible for a Roman slave to enjoy a life exceeding that of the average plebeian or lower class, and some slaves even ended up being incredibly wealthy, influential, and sitting right beside the emperor as a trusted friend. On the other hand, less lucky slaves could be tossed to the lions as a bit of casual entertainment. Slavery in ancient Rome was a lot more complex than you might think, involving far more than Romans heading off to the market to purchase an expendable human being with their eggs and milk. Skilled slaves were very valuable assets, but still slaves. If you were a skilled slave, you had a fair chance at a good life. Simply being able to read and write made a slave a valuable asset, elevating them from above most other common types of slave at the time. A literate slave could land up being something akin to a personal assistant, and in such cases hoped for good treatment. Life may even have been rather pleasant, especially considering the getting eaten by the lions alternative. This isn't to say the slave stopped being a slave though, and still they certainly didn't have many rights depending on the era of ancient Rome that we're talking about. It's just that an owner would be far less likely to beat or mistreat someone that they became familiar with. Not to mention that the owner had a substantial monetary investment to think about. To put it into perspective, a common Roman foot soldier, the legionary, earned an annual salary of 900 sesterces. A centurion, meanwhile, a commander in the Roman army, earned an annual salary of around 13,000 sesterces. If you were a slave that was moderately skilled, at least able to read or write and able to learn a trade, you could fetch a sum of up to 2,000 sesterces. Particularly skilled slaves, such as a vine dresser, someone capable of cultivating grapevines, could go for up to 8,000 sesterces. Needless to say, if a slave was purchased for 8,000, an owner was probably going to make sure that the person was well fed and cared for. That said, technically speaking, under slavery laws, an owner could still just do about anything they wanted to their slave. They could beat them, rape them, torture them, and they wouldn't face legal consequences. But that's not to say that mistreatment of slaves was socially acceptable. Abusive owners were firmly looked down on in Roman society, and being socially accepted was an essential part of achieving success. If you were an especially lucky slave, your owner may have even sent you off to receive a valuable education. The famed Marcus Licinius Crassus, often referred to as the richest man in ancient Rome, made some of his fortune by running a school that specialized in teaching slaves valuable skills. Now, that's not to say that Crassus had a soft spot for slaves, given that he captured and executed 6,000 in a battle against the rebelling slave Spartacus. We'll be hearing more from Spartacus shortly. Up to 20% of the Roman population was slaves, and they sometimes rebelled. Slavery was so ingrained in ancient Roman society that it's estimated that at least 10% and as much as 20% of the total population was made up of those in servitude. If taking into account the total population of the Roman Empire in the 1st century CE, 50 million, this means that between 5 and 10 million were slaves. It's a rather staggering number, raising the question as to why the slaves didn't simply rise up and revolt. Well, they sometimes did, as in the story of the legendary Spartacus. A number of slave rebellions, referred to as the Servile Wars or Slave Wars, rocked Rome between 135 BCE and 71 BCE, the most famous of which is the Third Servile War. In 73 BCE, Spartacus and around 70 other gladiators escaped from a training school, overcoming the soldiers sent to recapture them and forming into a rebelling slave army of around 120,000 escaped men, women, and children. The army, led and trained by Spartacus, proved to be a powerful force, putting the Roman military to shame for many years. The Senate grew increasingly more concerned, fearing that Spartacus and his army may eventually overthrow Rome itself. It seemed for a while Spartacus may do exactly that, until finally he and his army were put down in the battle with Marcus Crassus. Spartacus died heroically, according to accounts. As to why the millions of slaves didn't rebel more often, there were a number of factors discouraging or making it difficult for slaves to organize and rise up. Most prominent was that even if slaves did make up a large portion of the population, they didn't come from a single nationality or geographic group. The slaves were prisoners of war that came from wherever or whoever Rome was attempting to conquer at that time. Other slaves were criminals, victims of kidnapping and piracy, and some were even those so financially in debt that they decided selling themselves into slavery was simply the best option. Of course, the best way to keep the 5 to 10 million slaves obedient wasn't violence at all. It was by promising them that they would one day get a hat. A slave was freed with a hat. A Roman slave lived in servitude with the hopes of one day getting a pileus, a soft felt hat that symbolized the slave securing freedom. A freed slave was taken before the magistrate, and in an elaborate ceremony they had their head shaved and their hair replaced with a pileus. This slave then had full freedom and was even granted citizenship. It's unknown how common manumission, the act of freeing a slave, was, but it is known that an owner was at least socially expected to free their slaves at some point, even if freedom was only granted in a will. Either way, manumission was significantly more likely for city-dwelling skilled slaves and far more achievable for males. A less common form of manumission was for an owner to simply grant a slave freedom at a chosen time. The owner likely only did this if the slave could reimburse their original value at the very least, and would probably also owe a considerable additional debt to be paid over time. Hence, it was unlikely for a mining slave, for example, to ever purchase their freedom and receive their pileus, given that the unskilled individual would likely never earn enough doing their job and wouldn't find much financial success outside of hard manual labor. For female slaves, the best chance of receiving a pileus was marriage, most often to an owner. However, as nice as it must have been for a female slave to wear a lovely felt hat, sadly, although technically no longer a slave, she would still find herself in an unequal marriage with far fewer rights than her husband. There was a day when masters and slaves switched roles. Rejoice, Roman slaves, for Saturnalia is here, and for once, you get to be the master. Saturnalia was a popular Roman festival that originally took place on the 17th of December, celebrating the god Saturn. The festival, characterized by banquets, merrymaking, and gift-giving, evolved into the Christmas and New Year's of today, after Rome transitioned to Christianity in the 300 CE. The most interesting part of Saturnalia was that it encouraged owners and slaves to temporarily switch roles. In the spirit of celebrating liberty and freedom, slaves sat at their masters' tables, were served by their masters, and were even allowed to criticize their masters without fear of punishment. It was all in good fun and meant to strengthen the bond of all those, slave and owner alike, living under Roman rule. Though, assumedly, these role-switching antics were only reserved for master and slave relationships that didn't involve working to death in mine shafts. Historian Diodorus Siculus, 1st century BCE, explained the horrific conditions that slaves, mostly unskilled prisoners of war and incarcerated criminals, worked in under the Spanish mines. Quote, "The slaves who are engaged in the working of the mines produce for their masters revenues in sums defying belief, but they themselves wear out their bodies both by day and by night in the diggings under the earth, dying in large numbers because of the exceptional hardships they endure. For no respite or pause is granted them in their labors, but compelled beneath blows of the overseers to endure the severity of their plight, they throw away their lives in this wretched manner." So, chances are that during Saturnalia, owners didn't go down into the mines and let their slaves beat and whip them. Difficult slaves wore identification collars. If the beatings and whippings ever did get too much for laboring slaves, and God forbid if a slave ever tried to escape and perhaps join Spartacus, the levels of punishment could be as humiliating as they were brutal. A slave could land up with an identification collar around their neck, or even with their face permanently disfigured. If an escaped Roman slave was caught, it was common practice to make that person as easy to identify and recapture as possible. In the earliest eras of ancient Rome, the Kingdom and Republic eras, between 753 BCE and 27 CE, this meant branding or tattooing the slave's face. Now, this punishment was generally only reserved for the most difficult slaves, and Roman society did consider the treatment particularly cruel. Hence, Emperor Constantine passed a law forbidding the permanent disfiguring of slaves in 316 CE, and that's when the humane identification collars became common. Instead of disfigurement, slaves were fitted with something akin to a riveted, very difficult to remove dog collar. The collar often came with an identification tag, including some variation of "hold me and return me." A tag dating to the 4th century CE on display in the British Museum reads, "Hold me lest I flee, and return me to my master Viventius on the estate of Callistus." The philosopher Seneca in 55 or 56 BCE wrote, "It is creditable to a man to keep within reasonable bounds in his treatment of his slaves. Even in the case of a human chattel, one ought to consider not how much one can torture him with impunity, but how far such treatment is permitted by natural goodness and justice, which prompts us to act kindly towards even prisoners of war and slaves bought for a price." Slaves could become influential millionaires. Meet Narcissus, a former slave of Claudius Caesar that that amassed a staggering fortune of 400 million sesterces. With that kind of success, it isn't surprising that his name suggests that he was rather pleased with himself. Narcissus is a well-known name in ancient Roman history for many reasons, not in the least because the former slave was amongst the wealthiest of his time. If achieving massive wealth wasn't enough, Narcissus also secured a powerful job as correspondence secretary, allowing him to become an extremely influential presence in the life of Emperor Claudius. So trusted was Narcissus that Emperor Claudius allowed him to oversee the departure of troops for the famous war in Gaul. And with that war a success, Narcissus gained enduring popularity in Roman society. It is, needless to say, astounding that Narcissus overcame every hurdle of slavery, especially given that former slaves were still sometimes looked down on. With that being said, Narcissus is not the only slave to riches legend. Another fascinating story is that of Aulus Vertius Conviva and Aulus Vertius Restitutus. The well-known Roman town of Pompeii, preserved in ash after the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, provides an untouched snapshot of life in 79 CE. During the excavation of Pompeii, scholars came upon the house of Veti, a domus, a Roman dwelling, so large that it spanned an entire block, clearly belonging to incredibly wealthy individuals. The scholars were astounded when they found near overwhelming evidence that the two owners, Conviva and Restitutus, were previously slaves. How the former slaves, thought to be brothers, achieved their wealth isn't known, but it is clear they were very keen on making their wealth as evident as possible. Excessively broadcasting wealth is a trend seen elsewhere across ancient Rome, often attributed to successful freemen putting their achievements front and center. Since freemen had to overcome the societal stigma before gaining acceptance, broadcasting their financial success was the logical thing to do. Hence, successful freemen tended to live in exceptionally luxurious houses and to leave opulent memorials and funerary inscriptions. In the old port-adjacent town of Ostia, now a site of major archaeological importance, around 80% of all funerary memorials belong to former slaves. This may seem to suggest that the town was largely inhabited by former slaves, but it's actually rather an indication that successful slaves were just more determined to leave proof of their status. The sad truth is that many Roman slaves left nothing at all to their names, not even graves.